Welcome, welcome, welcome. We see many of our colleagues and friends entering the Zoom call, entering our conversation focused on boots on the ground, practitioner-approved post-secondary resources and tools. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our many colleagues and friends that are on the line. For those of you who I have not had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Tina Gridiron, and I'm Vice President of Philanthropic Partnerships with ACT Center for Equity and Learning. Today, we have a host of leaders in the education space to talk about what they are seeing on the ground, what is working in the midst of this time of COVID-19, and yet we are all moving forward in supporting students the best way that we can. Before we get started, please know that we are very excited to have the Executive Director of the Grant Makers for Education with us. We're going to start with giving our great colleague, Celine Coggins, an opportunity to welcome the group. Celine, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey everybody, I just wanted to say a quick hello and welcome and thank you for joining us today. I also wanted to mention that I am leaving in the middle of this call because we have our conference planning committee selection process happening this afternoon starting at 12:30 Eastern. And that is just a way to say we are still having our conference. It is going to be virtual. We'll be getting the word out on that shortly, but block that second week in October. All right, thanks so much.
Thanks so much for joining us, Celine. And for those of you who are on the call, please note that we will be recording this session, as is our practice. We want to make sure to capture all the great information that is shared. So please note that we are recording the session. Today, you will note that at the bottom of your screen, there are two places. There's a Q&A place and there's a chat spot. Please note that you can input questions as the webinar proceeds, and we will make sure to capture all those questions. And we have set aside time at the end of our session today for a robust Q&A time where we will be responding to many of the questions that are shared in the Q&A section or in the chat box. So whichever approach works for you, please know that you are welcome. Today's webinar is being brought to you by the Grant Makers for Education and the Post-Secondary Access and Attainment Impact Group. Within the Grant Makers for Education, there are different impact groups where funders come together to share ideas, to have robust conversations of learning, to improve practice, to think about future areas of strategy. And the Post-Secondary Access and Attainment Group has a mission to deepen its learning, to facilitate collaboration, to inspire and take collective action at scale as a group of funders, all focused around the issue of post-secondary access and attainment for students. We are excited today to have as our moderator for the session today, the chair of the Post-Secondary Access and Attainment Group, Angela Sanchez, who is also a program officer with the ECMC Foundation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our colleague, Angela, to take us into the conversation. Angela?
Thank you, Tina. And good morning, everyone who's on the call today. Thank you for joining. Again, I'm Angela Sanchez. I am a program officer for our college success team at ECMC Foundation. I am thrilled to present our panelists here with you today. Why don't we give a very quick overview of our session? So I will be introducing everyone. They will each have a moment to share more about their individual work with their organization. We're going to jump into a panel Q&A. And then as your questions go into the chat or into the Q&A function on this webinar, Tina will be collecting them and we will be then sharing them with our panel. So please listen carefully. I hope this generates some great conversation and a lot of necessary questions right now. Without further ado, let's introduce some of our panelists. So first off, we will have Kim Cook. Kim is the Executive Director for the National College Attainment Network, NCAN, as many of you may know. Kim has been with NCAN since 2008. As a former Pell Grant recipient herself, Kim personally understands the imperative to help more students, especially those who have been historically underserved by higher education, secure a post-secondary credential. At NCAN, Kim sets the vision for supporting 400 member organizations across the country, serving an estimated 2 million students annually in their mission to achieve significantly higher college enrollment and graduation rates than national averages for low-income students and students of color. Joining us today as well is Abigail Selden. Abigail is the CEO of Selden Herring Smith Foundation, which she co-founded with her husband, Whitney Herring Smith, in 2019. Selden Herring Smith Foundation seed stage public interest projects and collaborates with leading tech companies to build tools for the new college majority. At Selden Herring Smith Foundation, Abigail has led the development of Swift Student, a free digital tool for college students seeking financial aid appeals, which you will hear about more shortly today. And then finally, our last panelist for today, although certainly not least, Debbie Raucher, who is currently serving as John Burton Advocates for Youth Project Director, providing leadership and strategic visioning for their education initiatives. In this role, Debbie provides technical assistance and training designed to improve post-secondary educational outcomes for foster youth, along with implementation of a statewide advocacy agenda crafted to better address the needs of foster youth attending college. For the uninitiated, John Burton Advocates for Youth, affectionately called JBAY, is a California statewide nonprofit focused in improving the quality of life for California's foster youth, former foster youth, and homeless youth. I would also be remiss if I did not mention that JBAY is also an ECMC Foundation grantee. So maybe kicking us off then, I will hand it over to Kim Cook to provide an overview of NCAN and the results of one of the most recent NCAN member surveys as well. Kim, are you ready to jump in?
Ready to go. Thank you. Thank you, Angela, Tina, and Celine for this invitation and an important conversation to share what we as practitioners at National College Attainment Network and our 400 members who are direct service providers to students and families around the country are experiencing rapidly with everyone. The first piece I'd like to share on the next slide is the results of a very quick survey we put out in the field to our members to ask in COVID times, what are your immediate needs as a program, and what are the immediate needs you're hearing from students? So how can we help meet those? I've shared them on the slide, and we did not get to programming right away, right? We expected there would be a little more conversation about programming, but what we found, unfortunately, makes a lot of sense. That we can't talk about programming until, as 82% of our participants told us, we've really addressed digital access and devices. After that, we went to very basic needs: housing, food, and healthcare, then back to learning and distance and remote, and then into some of the programmatic parts I'll touch on later in my slides, and then I know my co-panelists will do deeper dives into FAFSA completion support, mental health counseling, self-care strategies, and then very nuts and bolts and programmatic accessing emergency aid. I list those, and then it struck me as I read this, as we all think back to our Psychology 101, how much this looked like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and how this was not a survey that told us we need to know the nuts and bolts of digital advising and virtual advising, and we need to know how to contact students, but how much our programs really fill many of those basic needs or help refer students to social supports that students need. So it was very real for us that many of our students who are already in college were coming back to their programs as trusted advisors and saying, I have now lost my housing, I have lost my meal plan, which means I have lost where I eat every day. I don't have access to health care or mental health counseling, and how many of our member programs and practitioners really scrambled to help students meet those very immediate human needs before we even got to what suddenly seemed like the luxuries of talking about their education and their post-secondary path. So I'll share that, and as I said, I know many of our my co-panelists will dive deeper into some case studies on that. Can I have the next slide, please? So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is how much FAFSA completion has been impacted by COVID. and this absence from campus and absence from supports that students need, whether that's nagging or whether that's what does this question mean and how do I fill that out. This is a chart on our NCAN Form Your Future FAFSA tracker, which is available and updated every 2 weeks with data from the Office of Federal Student Aid. And this shows that we're now looking at about a 3.5 percentage point decline in year to year compared to this point last year in FAFSA completion. And that's approximately 60,000 FAFSAs. So 3.5% may or may not sound material to you, but when we make that 61,000 students, that's certainly a real number for us. And if we can go to the next slide, that's about renewals, which is new data. These data have not been made public by FSA in the past, so these are new conversations for us to have. Renewals saw similar declines, and those renewal numbers really add up to almost 350,000 students who completed a FAFSA last year but have not renewed it this year. And in a time when higher ed is really looking for some signs and signals about what the fall holds for fall enrollment and what affordability issues are, we think this is really the canary in the coal mine because we know how powerful, what a powerful indicator FAFSA completion can be for ultimate post-secondary enrollment. Beyond the FAFSA renewal, on the next slide, please. I was asked to talk briefly about policy, and I know we might get into this more in Q&A, but wanted to talk about some of the impact it has had on our students and our member programs who serve them. First, there was a lot of confusion about stimulus checks and who was eligible, particularly for citizenship status, undocumented students, and some students, some dependent students did not get checks either. So we have sorted through a lot of the who gets a check, how do you get a check, is there an appeal to be made? Is there confusion, or was that just an oversight in the legislation? We are grateful that students were given loan forbearance. It's automatic. At the beginning it wasn't, now it is automatic, so that is some breathing room for many of our students as they navigate other financial realities due to job loss or job loss in their family. Emergency aid is something I'd be happy to talk about more when we get into the Q&A. But it has been a mess, honestly. I think the intentions here were good to provide students with some direct aid, but the rollout had a lot of late, delayed, confusing, and still being revised guidance about who was eligible and how the money could be allocated. So I think there were good intentions there. We at NCAN are talking, if there is to be future consideration of emergency aid, our recommendation that we really focus that aid on students like Pell-eligible students who we already know have great financial need and who are in a program and system that already has a delivery model that we know works. And then lastly, my final slide, I'll just queue up some future conversations about what's on the horizon. Programmatically, we've been talking a lot about advising models. There has been a lot of chatter about virtual advising and what promise that holds, where that's effective, what supports it needs to become more effective and to scale. There are many chatbots, and those can serve some level of immediate questions that students have. But then there's a lot of these conversations like an appeal of financial aid that I know Abigail will talk about, or professional judgment, where it needs to be an ongoing relationship and have follow-up and talk about that. So advising models are challenging to think about, and summer melt is more real this year than any year. The estimates now are at least 20% of students will not return to campus. So I'm going to extrapolate those onto students who would be first-time students on campus as well, and all of the supports we need to help students know that college is still important, college is still valuable. In the last recession, over 80% of the post-recovery jobs required post-secondary degrees, so we want to keep up the drumbeat to keep yourself in the game and keep taking the steps necessary to go to college this fall. On the financial front, emergency aid continues to be, some students still haven't received that emergency aid. Some colleges are still figuring out how to disperse that, and there is a lot of confusion about that. FAFSA completion, I showed you those slides that we now have over 400,000 students, less than fewer students than last year who have completed a FAFSA, and we're thinking about ways to message that broadly. And then I know that my co-panelist Abigail will talk a lot about financial appeals, but clearly when you're completing a FAFSA using information from 2 years ago, that information has radically changed, and we need to support students in how they do that. So that's probably a good segue, Angela, to pass it back to you and on to Abigail.
Thank you, Kim. Appreciate the elucidating information and also what you're seeing so far in terms of students' financial need. And that's actually really helpful to see about FAFSA renewals. I will say that as a funder, one of the things I've seen permeate the news a lot has been more about high school seniors and their FAFSA completion and transitioning from high school to college. But having that glimpse of what renewal looks like for continuing college students is really, it's enlightening and also a bit scary as well. On that note, I do want to turn it over to Abigail Selden and maybe a glimmer of hope in terms of one of the resources and tools that your foundation is building.
Thanks, Angela. So I should caveat, well, I'll introduce myself, then I'll caveat heavily on the tech front. So Angela mentioned I'm Abigail Selden. I'm the CEO of the Selden Herring Smith Foundation. We do 3 kinds of work at the foundation. We sponsor and fund public precedent-setting public interest projects, which tends to be early-stage public interest projects. And we also collaborate with outside corporate partners to build new tech tools for the new college majority, so today's college students. And we run an internal fellows program to facilitate research that is even earlier stage than our grantees will take, and typically interdisciplinary. Our higher ed work focuses on a population that overlaps substantially with what Kim just described. We focus on students struggling with basic needs, student parents, who are now 22% of all college students, as well as students who have stopped out of college or defaulted on their loans. And so as we look out at the landscape, we're interested in some of the structural changes, and that's part of what led us to build Swift Student, which I'll share with you now. So Swift Student is a project that our foundation led, but really is a coalition project in higher ed. We partnered with 18 leading higher ed organizations, including NCAN, to build this tool. And when I say collaborate, we had a shared Google Doc with all of these groups, and they did line edits on every draft of the text that has ultimately gone up on the site. And so it was a pretty deep, intensive process, including and especially with the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. And what we were trying to answer with this site, which is free, is how can I request a change to my college financial aid package? The vast majority of students don't know that the financial aid package that they're offered by their school can be appealed, and that there are changes they can request to it under a variety of circumstances. It is not their fault by any stretch that they don't know this. Most schools do not proactively advertise or include the information on their websites. And until COVID-19, the FAFSA website that's put out by federal student aid, did not include any information about appeals. And now they have some basic information. So we really wanted to help fill that gap for students, so that way they knew that this was an option for them. So Swift Student helps you write a financial aid appeal letter for free. So we go through, am I eligible? What documents do I need? How do I write an appeal letter? How do I submit my letter to the financial aid office? And we highlight 6 cases here, and I'll walk you through one of them. But one of the things I think that's critical to highlight to any audience is that Swift Student is not designed to replace any existing appeals process at any school. We really built this to help students start the appeals conversation with their financial aid office. It is meant to be a free resource for schools to enhance their process, which again, with COVID-19 and folks going remote, has been critical, because previously many financial aid offices explained this process to students who came to see them in person, when they came to see them in person. So this will help them get to scale. Swift Student is free to students and financial aid offices. There's no sign-up process with us at all. So we're actually really been pleased to see that we have consistent traffic in all 50 states, and that schools that we have no relationship with have begun to push the tool out to their students. And our partners, as I mentioned, include many leaders in the space. And actually, this is limited. These are only the folks who got me their logos on time. So there are others who will be added with the next deployment of code, including ACT. And so I'll walk you quickly through how this works. But fundamentally, these are the early ones that we've added. And the site is public. You can visit it. We encourage you to visit it. We'd love it if you would help distribute it to your grantees to share it through the sector. Our most popular requests will not surprise you. How do I ask for more financial aid if the FAFSA does not capture a financial difficulty I'm currently facing? This is the leading question we get, and followed closely by emergency aid requests and how do I exclude my parents' information from the FAFSA? So I'll walk you quickly through this. There's a long explanation of text here. I don't know how many folks on this call have deep relationships with college students, but students of any age and any demographic tend to be pretty busy, and so they probably won't read all this text that we lovingly edited with our partners. They will click Create My Document, and they'll go straight into editing the form letter that we've provided for them to engage with their school. And this is where it gets pretty cool. So we partnered with an external tech company, FormSwift, to build this tool, and they're going to maintain it in perpetuity for free. And that saved our foundation untold hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, in construction and maintenance, and also gives the users the benefit of this fabulous software that's been built and tested in for the last 10 years on a population that's substantively similar to them. So what is today's date? We hit save and continue, and it dynamically updates on the right instantaneously. Some of the things that we included here, you can see were seeded from our focus groups. We did more than 20 focus groups to build this tool, 10 with financial aid officers and 10 with college students of varying demographics. The financial aid officers, who have been among the biggest proponents actually of this tool and been not just embracing it, but bear hugging it, said that one of the barriers they face to getting successful appeals is that students won't put their full names on the forms or on the letters they send, or they'll send their inquiries from their personal email addresses, which won't display their names. And so they can't even begin to match the student with the correct file. And so sometimes students don't get responses because they didn't include their full name, or they didn't include all of their contact information. And so, these are really basic barriers to students getting access to federal student aid or even additional school financial aid. And so we built these into the process for the students. And the financial aid officers had requested really small things like, can you ensure that the header has the student's name and the student ID number? And so we've done that. The student ID number will populate later in this process. And then here's the guidance that we skipped earlier. We wanted to put it in situ for the students as we knew that many would skip it. And so what aspects of your financial situation are not fully captured in your FAFSA? So my parents both lost their jobs due to COVID-19. And we are now living on their unemployment. Now I'd say that's a best case scenario for many of our students coming up this fall. So as we fill that out, you see it just dynamically updates to being at the end of the first paragraph. And then we have complete this sentence. I have attached supporting documentation, including my parents' unemployment paperwork. And then again, it updates. And then what is your student ID number? And if we prompt them to understand where to find it, since that's not always a factor that students memorize. Certainly I didn't memorize my student ID in college. And then that's it. And so the next step for students is to download a copy of their letter, and they can export it as a PDF or a Word document, or they can email it to themselves, and then to send it on to their financial aid office. We don't have access to any of the underlying data that the students submit, though there is an optional survey for them to complete. And that's it. We have Swift Student is available across a variety of different types of letters, as I shared. We'd welcome your support sharing this more broadly with your grantees and on social media. But fundamentally, as Kim highlighted, the level of melt we're going to see this fall is unbelievable. And so this tool is only as good as the outreach it gets to students, unless they know that they can ask for more financial aid and that there is more support for them. It's like a tree falling in the woods. So really glad to have the opportunity to share this with you today, and looking forward to your questions in the Q&A session.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Abigail. Appreciate it. That was, and just to clarify again, so Swift Student is a free resource. Are you understand that we're here with funders in the audience? Are you looking for additional funding, or do you just want us to get the word out?
We just want you to get the word out. SHSF is fully funding it, and indeed its ongoing costs are de minimis because FormSwift is continuing to operate it. One of our goals as a foundation is to make these things affordable in the long term. And so we're modeling out that kind of partnership with this group and with our Getty partnership that we'll talk about a little later. So we are looking for folks to share this widely. And
that is absolutely fantastic to hear. Thank you. All right. And finally, turning to Debbie Raucher with John Burton Advocates for Youth. Would love to hear more about what you're working on, as well as what you are currently hearing in the field at large.
Great, thanks Angela, and thank you for having me today. So as was mentioned by Angela, my name is Debbie Raucher. I'm with John Burton Advocates for Youth. The focus of my organization, as was described in my bio, is working on post-secondary access and success for foster youth and students experiencing homelessness. We do this through two strategies, primarily policy advocacy and technical assistance and training. I'm really focusing on college student success, as well as supporting high school students to transition to college successfully, again, for these two specific subpopulations. Most of our history has been working with the foster youth population, but in the last couple of years, we've branched out to students experiencing homelessness. And I think that with the foster youth population, while it is a very small population, I think it's a population that can nonetheless be instructive. It tends to be a population with the highest level of need of any subpopulation. And so understanding strategies that are successful for supporting this particular population can be instructive for how to address the needs of other special populations. So if we go to the next slide, thank you. So to just give an overview of what I've been hearing in the field, and although we didn't do a formal survey like NCAN did, my observations align very closely to what was shared earlier. The needs that we're seeing, technology access, huge one, not surprisingly, given the transition to online learning. Basic needs and income support, again, not surprising given the economic situation, but many of our students are really struggling right now with housing, food, transportation. Mental health is one that is coming up more and more as the stress of both COVID-19 and the economic crisis are taking their toll on folks. We're hearing about a rising need for access to mental health services. And then the transition to online learning. And I think with populations like ours, so with the foster youth population, with students who are experiencing homelessness, that transition to online learning has been perhaps even more challenging than for some other students who are in a more stable housing situation or better equipped with access to technology. And many of them have expressed to us concerns about whether they feel like they can be successful in this new paradigm that we're in for now. So if we can go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about two sort of case examples, walking you through the biggest efforts that we've engaged with specifically around COVID-19. So the first one is around the technology access piece. And what we realized when the crisis first hit, when here in California there were shelter-in-place orders issued, we knew before that the foster youth were very disadvantaged in terms of technology access even before the crisis. They would use library computers, borrow computers from on-campus programs, and suddenly found themselves in a situation where in California, our colleges actually did a pretty amazing job transitioning to online learning. Classes went online very quickly, and so students that didn't have the technology access were very much disadvantaged and were at risk of having to drop out of school. So we were actually approached by a couple of foundations. So the Pritzker Foster Care Initiative here in California, as well as the Walter S. Johnson Foundation, both foundations that had even before the crisis, this had been an area where they had focused a lot of energies was around technology access. They quickly realized the risk and what our students were going to be potentially struggling with, and came to us and asked us to partner with them to figure out a way to address this. So I will say that honestly, I don't want to brag, but I feel like this has been one of the most successful efforts we've ever engaged in at John Burton Advocates for Youth. It was pretty phenomenal. We've given out over 3,000 laptops to date. We have 50 out of our 58 counties participating. 182 different campuses are providing laptops to their students. And it really was because of the partnerships that we were able to create. I mean, really because of the partnerships that pre-existed, that predated this, that we were able to leverage. So what we did as JBay is we kind of served as a central hub for this effort, developing the strategy, pulling in a number of additional philanthropic partners to provide funding. We worked with the community college system. They actually provided some funding to this effort. We were extremely fortunate that we have an organization called iFoster here in California that was already set up to be able to distribute technology to foster youth. That was a big part of their pre-existing mission. And then we have a network of campus support programs, about 125 programs specifically targeting foster youth across the state of California that we have ongoing relationships with and have worked with for many years. And so we were able to bring all of those different partners together to set up a system. And as I was going back through old emails to kind of remind myself, and what was amazing to me was how quickly we made this happen. And I really want to give a shout out to, again, the Pritzker Foster Care Initiative and Walter S. Johnson, who just were amazingly flexible and fast in their ability to respond and work with us. And that was just key. So within 1 week, we had this thing up and running. We had about 600 laptops already shipped and out the door 1 week after stay-at-home orders went in place, because we just recognized the imperative of getting these resources to students quickly. We've tried to do something similar with the K-12 systems. It has been much more challenging. It has been harder to identify students that have a need for technology, a lot more bureaucracy in leveraging the public resources. And there's been issues that have come up around whether students are allowed to own these devices or not. Here in California, we have a very locally controlled K-12 structure, and that lack of centralization has been one of the biggest challenges. There's more centralization within our post-secondary systems through the local chancellor's offices, and so that made that part of the work easier. So if we can go to the next slide. The second example I want to give is the second sort of effort that we undertook, which is what we call our Rapid Response Fund. And this is to address student basic needs. And as was already kind of discussed a little bit earlier, what we found were there was these big gaps in emergency funding, that we have all these students who couldn't pay for their housing, that weren't able to buy food, and that the existing funds just were not well targeted. I think people are probably well aware of the problems with the emergency resources that came down from the CARES Act, but even some of the philanthropically funded efforts, I think one of the challenges is that it's labor intensive to really identify what the needs are and to direct the resources accordingly. And so a lot of the funds that exist here in California have been structured such that, if you meet a certain income threshold or if you're Pell eligible, everybody gets $500, where you might have a student though that truly doesn't have a need for funding right now because they're able to live with their parents and they're in a stable situation, and somebody else who might be $2,000 behind in their rent and is going to become homeless. A lot of these funds also aren't really structured to link students to longer term supports to make sure that their situation is sustainable. and the federal dollars, of course, excluded many students. So if you go to the next slide. So this is also a funder-initiated strategy. In this case, the Stewart Foundation approached us to figure out a way to target rapid response resources directly to foster youth with needs. So we, again, developed a strategy that really, again, partnership was so key in this. We identified an organization called Together We Rise here in California that's able to sort of provide direct financial resources to students, but coupling it with some limited case management support. So if we can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, if we can go back one. Sorry, I missed a couple of points. There we go. So what we have done is, together with the Stewart Foundation, we've solicited additional funding from other philanthropic partners. So we've had other funders put money into the fund now, which is great. Still probably not going to meet the full need. We've gotten a lot of requests coming in. Again, we're able to leverage the existing support structures. So using these campus-based programs, housing programs for foster youth, other nonprofit organizations, to have them identify who the students are with the greatest level of need, with true emergency needs, verify eligibility, and then make those referrals. And so what this program is able to do, the private funding is really filling the gaps that are not being met by some of the public funding sources. At the same time, one of the keys is supporting leverage of public sources. So what Together We Rise is able to do when they provide, here's your $1,500 emergency payment to pay your landlord so you don't lose your housing. At the same time, we're going to make sure that you've signed up for unemployment, that you got your stimulus check, that you've signed up for SNAP to get food benefits, and to make sure that those longer term resources are also in place so that the student doesn't develop another emergency need a month later because they still can't pay their rent. So next slide. So moving forward, kind of where I see the needs in the future. So with college retention, again, the basic needs issue is just going to continue to be enormous. And if the students don't have food and housing, it's going to be very challenging for them to stay in school. Connecting and engaging. So one of the other things that we're seeing is just a lot of students disconnecting and not accessing the resources that are available. And we're very worried about students who have the highest level of need and them falling through the cracks. And so really there's going to be a much stronger need for programs that can be very proactive in reaching out to the students who maybe have disengaged in order to re-engage them. Mental health, I mentioned before, there's a lot of great examples here in California about how mental health services have been able to transition to telehealth, and that's been enormously important. And then support for online learning. And I don't mean that in terms of support for colleges to implement online learning. I actually mean that as support for students to be able to, how can we support them to be successful in an online learning environment? And then we've also looked at some of the issues around high school to college transition. Again, basic needs and benefits access, huge. Financial aid access, as mentioned before, about the drop in FAFSA completion. And so what can we do to support students to access those resources, summer melt, and then just support for that matriculation process. If you can't walk into an office and ask your questions about how to register, how do we make sure that students are getting the support that they need to get through that process? And that's it for me. Turn it back over to Angela.
Thank you, Debbie. And just a quick heads up to everyone who is joining us virtually right now. My apartment building is testing our fire alarm system right now. So for whatever reason, I need to mute myself suddenly. That is why. Now, let's transition over then to some of the questions that we have set for our panelists. Again, while these questions are being asked to our audience members, please feel free to drop your own into the Q&A or into the chat. We definitely want to hear from you. These will just be a few brief warm-up round. We do also want to make sure we leave a healthy 10 to 15 minutes for discussion. All right, so kicking us off, this came up in, this came up across all of our panelists, but Kim, I do want to just acknowledge that you did share the stat of we're expecting post-secondary enrollment to drop by 20%. this year predominantly affecting our students who come from low-income homes and other marginalized backgrounds. And Debbie, you also provide the very helpful perspective of what this means to our students from who are experiencing homelessness and who are coming from the foster care system as well. So, understanding these issues at play, what are organizations doing to prevent students from falling through the cracks, and more specifically, also, what can funders be doing at this time? And anyone who wants to jump in on this question, please feel free to do so.
I'm happy to kick off with a broader picture. That seems to be my role today. So I would say we are very worried about what this fall looks like and what fall enrollment looks like for students who have been hit with a number of challenges. The first is that we need all hands on deck to convey a message that college is even more important now than perhaps it had been, and that we need to find a way to keep you on track. We also know what the data tell us about the importance of starting and staying enrolled, and that this idea, this fantasy of a gap year or a stop out is just going to be a student who probably never goes to college, never mind completes. So messaging is important. The other piece is helping our students navigate that, because I don't go to the four-year institution that's 250 miles from my home doesn't mean I don't go to college. So let's talk about what the options are, even if they're interim options. Maybe you started a community college that has a strong articulation agreement with the four-year that you want to go to, and that hits some affordability issues for you, and that you can work with that four-year institution like I used to do when I was in admissions with many students who say, I'm planning to come here, tell me what to take so I can stay on track to do that. So I think messaging and then flexibility and support for interim options are really key. So to the extent that funders can support those conversations and work with their partners, perhaps in higher ed, about being flexible and allowing students to defer but attend a community college in the meantime, these are all important institutional policies to consider.
Debbie, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'll add a couple of things. So one is, I think that funding organizations that have a strategy for finding students who are most likely to fall through the cracks. And so, quite frankly, it's a lot easier if a student hasn't fallen through the cracks yet and needs some support to be able to address the needs of those students. It's a lot harder to find the ones who may have planned to enroll and now aren't. But any organization that has a strategy for trying to identify those students or prospective students, I would encourage funding of those. And the other thing I'll just say is I would encourage funders to, when you're creating programs, not create limitations based on things like minimum GPA, number of units of enrollment, academic standing. I see that a lot, and by doing that, what happens is the students with the greatest level of need get eliminated because they're the ones most likely to be faltering on their GPA, or they need to work full time, and so they can only enroll in 6 units, or whatever it is. So the more flexible you can be on those kinds of criteria, the better.
I have a couple things to add too. I think I'm very tactical when it comes to these items, but some of the best things that we've seen out there in the field are from one of our grantees, Montgomery College in Montgomery County, Maryland. They are distributing laptops that they're getting from their corporate partners to their student body, and from their funders who have extra laptops around. And so that's something very simple that your offices can probably do. Any extra IT that you have around, this is a time when that may seem small to you or to your teams, but makes a tremendous difference to pass along to your colleges and college access partners. Montgomery College also very thoughtfully at the very beginning of COVID reallocated their budget for their in-person graduation ceremony to their emergency aid fund. And I know that many funders have convenings that they had sponsored or set up that they were going to run personally in the second half of the year that will now not happen, encouraging your grantees to reuse those dollars for something that's immediate, like emergency aid, or doing that yourself from your budget is something that can make a material difference. In terms of things that we're doing and that I'd love to see other funders do as well, and that we hear from our grantees are important, are lowering the reporting burden for your grants if you possibly can. Many of our grantees are now at home with their children, and their staff are at home with their children, and also their clients and the populations they're serving are in greater distress. They really don't have a lot of spare time to fill out long reports for their funders. And many of these reports just sit on all of our shelves anyway and don't get a lot of action. So that's something that is really meaningful that you can do for your grantees fairly quickly.
Thank you all. And so understanding that we've seen, I think Abigail, you raised a good point about what are the needs of the grantees at this time too. That segues well into another question that we have, which is what are the pain points or areas of need that just aren't getting as much attention right now, either among students, among organizational staff. I think we're really curious to know though here as a group of funders, what are students currently asking for? And then how have you seen either your organization or other organizations vocalize these needs?
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in with a thought. So in terms of areas not getting as much attention, one thing that we're really trying to raise the visibility of is the issue of satisfactory academic progress and the loss of financial aid as a result of not making satisfactory academic progress. So for those who aren't familiar, students need to maintain certain standards, typically a 2.0 GPA, completing a certain percentage of courses attempted. And if they don't meet that standard for 2 semesters, they lose all of their financial aid. And the likelihood that they're going to be able to maintain enrollment after that is slim. And colleges offer appeals processes. As Abigail talked about, a lot of these appeals processes are very opaque. They're not well advertised. Students don't necessarily understand how to navigate them. And they're often very limited in terms of what they're willing to consider as extenuating circumstances. And so we're really trying to educate colleges and actually even implementing policies at the state level to change some of the criteria around satisfactory academic progress. Because for the foster youth population, we've started to do some research and seen that close to 60% of foster youth and community colleges are not making SAP in their first semester. It's just an extraordinary number. And it is a huge contributing factor to the huge dropout rates that we see among foster youth, homeless students, low-income populations. And so I think it's really important to draw some attention to not just the issue of FAFSA completion at the front end, but how we can help students keep their aid on the back end.
Something that we're seeing out there as a pain point that is coming, even if it's not fully here yet, is the underfunding of community colleges and HBCUs more broadly. Students at those schools are going to be much harder hit by this economic crisis, and indeed are already being hard hit. And those schools are not necessarily getting more funding because of that. And so we've been shoring up our commitments, and that's something that those organizations, I think, really need. The other thing that we're seeing is the need for more coordination among social services. More people than ever need social services and assistance with things like unemployment and food pantry access and SNAP and TANF, as well as emergency aid from colleges. And so we are hearing demand for that and looking at that as well. But that demand, I think, is nationwide.
I'll chime in that I think there's been a real pain point around policy, and to date that's been federal. Pushing money out to institutions without guidance, or with guidance that severely limited or confused how they could distribute emergency aid. Going across the board to everyone who completed a FAFSA at that institution and everybody getting $200 is not meaningful. So I don't think it was equitably targeted to those who had the most need. And I would say that's something to address in future packages. I think affordability, if you think we talked about affordability in the past, get ready for 10 times that conversation when you look at the unemployment numbers and the economic fallout happening in our country. So affordability is going to be key. And I think
one of the few institutions that has the capacity to address the affordability crunch that's about to happen is the federal government. And it's going to take a bold investment in our students with the greatest need to meet that.
Yeah, maybe on that point about affordability, actually, I do want to bring in some questions from our audience in our last few minutes. Is how do students and families now have leverage to demand reductions in the price of college? So we've seen some cases, well, actually we've seen a few notable cases in my own home state of California where the UC may be brought into a suit over tuition. And so can we ask for a reduction in tuition fees, and how can funders also support rethinking the price of college?
I can take the first bit.
Sure. Our audience is pulling no punches, by the way.
Good. Yes, students can and should ask. Federal regulations put together by the Department of Ed long before this crisis make it clear that students who have an economic issue that's not captured by the FAFSA, or who have had an economic setback not captured by the FAFSA, can ask for an adjustment to their financial aid package, and should. And so that is, full stop. So students should be approaching their schools, and we need to be encouraging students to do that en masse.
I mean, I'll say, in terms of asking colleges to actually reduce the price, irrespective of financial aid eligibility, but simply based on the fact that that classes have transitioned from in-person to online, and does that warrant a price reduction for everybody? I have a lot of sympathy for the students making that argument. At the same time, I know here in California, all three of our public education systems, public post-secondary education systems, are facing big budget cuts. And so, tuition reduction is going to reduce the amount of funding that they have available even further, which is going to create challenges. So getting back to Kim's point, what we're really hoping for here in California is the federal government is going to step in and provide support to local governments, to states and cities. Because, I know that here in California, if the federal government were to provide funding to the state to fill budget shortfalls, a big chunk of that would go into post-secondary education. And that might enable our public systems to be able to afford to look at tuition costs. But without that investment by the federal government, I'm just not sure realistically how that can happen.
Thank you. Actually, Debbie, I do have a question that is targeted directly to you. It was related to when you're talking about pre-existing relationships with campus-based programs. Are you referring to Guardian Scholars, EOPS? Is emergency funding getting distributed by Together We Rise? I see that that's what this question is referring to, or through community college financial aid or foundations.
Yeah, so I was referring to what we call Guardian Scholars programs here in California, which are these targeted support programs on college campuses for foster youth. We actually have foster youth liaisons designated at every single one of our 150 so institutions. And so that is kind of the network that we were able to leverage to roll the money out. The money is being dispersed directly by Together We Rise. So they're either issuing the money directly to the student or to a third party. If, say, it's a rent payment, maybe they'll issue it directly to the landlord. The money is not going through the financial aid office or the foundation, the college foundation.
Thank you. And for everyone, have you noticed a rise in the interest in career and technical education, so CTEs, or free online certification programs, such as those offered through Coursera or other third-party orgs?
I can take that one. We can't disaggregate the interest in CTE versus community college. I think that the distinction is sort of arbitrary anyway, but we are seeing a dramatic rise in interest in community colleges. One of the big concerns that I have is that the sector is not going to be funded more just because they're going to serve more students. But enrollment is already filling up for the summer and fall. In terms of free online programs, I have not seen that, but I'm actually hopeful that we won't, because most of those programs are not even correlated, let alone have causation for higher in employment rates, particularly for low-income and first-gen students.
Anyone else? It looks like we're down to our last 5 minutes. I want to give us one closer question. And I think this would be helpful to everyone on the call. So we've discussed a bit about emergency aid, and I think one of the things that a lot of our teams and foundations are kicking around is beyond emergency aid, what are our longer term improvement opportunities? So for example, Swift Student addresses systems changes for a process that many institutions struggle with in making efficient. Do you have any ideas for how foundations can focus our own limited resources or influence to encourage longer term thinking as well?
I definitely can speak to that. As an organization that primarily does policy advocacy, I'm going to make a plug for funding policy advocacy. It is something a lot of times foundations prefer to fund direct service. And I think that policy advocacy plays a key role. Just as what's the saying, if you give a man a fish, he eats for a day. If you teach him how to fish, he eats for a lifetime. I kind of think, if you fund direct service, some number of students get support, but if you fund a policy change, you can impact thousands, hundreds of thousands of students for many years to come. So, just to give a little tiny example of some of the policy advocacy we're doing right now around this issue of satisfactory academic progress, we have a bill in the California legislature that would require colleges to consider homelessness as an extenuating circumstance when evaluating appeals for SAP. And so if a student becomes homeless and their grades drop, we think that should pretty much universally be considered a valid reason for them to be able to continue to maintain their financial aid and not.
And it's not currently?
No.
Wow.
No, the only two things specified in federal law are death of the family and serious illness, not homelessness. So we're trying to make that, a law in California. And if it's a law, then it applies across the entire state to all of our campuses. So policy advocacy, that's my pitch.
I'll jump in that the emergency aid conversations are important. We all know the saying that students are a proverbial flat tire away from dropping out of school. That is an amount as small or as seemingly small as $300 can derail a student from continuing their education. That's a symptom. That is a problem, but it's also a symptom of a greater affordability issue. And I'm going to be the affordability soapbox today. But we've done research at NCAN called The Growing Gap, where we've learned that only 25% of public four-year institutions are affordable to a Pell Grant student who does everything right and gets all the average aid they should from all the sources that are out there. So emergency aid is kind of an end result problem. But if we really want to tackle this, we should tackle the big issue, which is the grand affordability issue and the paucity of need-based aid to address that.
Yeah, and I think echo a lot of that, which is, to get to scale, I think there are a lot of folks who will propose tech solutions, and certainly we've built one recently, but I would actually warn many foundations away from that. There's a lot of dreck out there in the space, and it's important to think about what's long-term, and no app is going to solve $1 trillion of underinvestment. Ours won't, neither will anybody else's. And so thinking about how to get additional resources allocated, focusing on local and state government. I think with your policy reach, particularly right now where we've got some federal problems in Washington, I think will be particularly valuable for your local partners and local institutions.
Excellent. Thank you, Abigail. And thank you all for your input today. I'm going to turn it over to Tina Gridiron to close us out because we are coming up on time. Thank you. Tina, you're on mute.
Thank you to our panelists and all of our participants for a rich conversation today. As you noted, we did record the session, and we will be making it available for those who would like to either share it or review it again. We will also be sending out an opportunity for attendees to give us feedback on the session. The Postsecondary Access and Attainment Impact Group is always trying to capture important new ideas to share with the philanthropic community. And we just want to thank our panelists for taking the extra time. We will share resources and links. You will see information on the page, on the slide right now about ways that you can subscribe for updates with the Grantmakers for Education and the video link access. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to great moderation by Angela Sanchez. Thank you all for staying with us for the hour, and we look forward to having you join us for the next webinar that Postsecondary Access and Attainment Group is preparing. Be on the lookout for new information about lots of webinars that GFE has in store for the field. Thanks so much for your time today. Check you out next time.